Alrighty, well, welcome back from spring break. Where did I go? I am going to. This is a kind of odd chapter because the chapter is entitled The Colonization of Land. So we're kind of going to deviate from what was on the syllabus. So there's only two chapters on the next test. There'll be chapter 26, and I think it's 33. This chapter focuses on the evolution of fungus and plants coming out of the ocean onto a terrestrial environment. Then in the next chapter, we're going to talk about just plant reproduction of angiosperms because it's kind of fun to learn where your food comes from because that's mostly that. We used to cover all of botany in this class, and we don't. It's no longer an SLO. Then we will do two chapters. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about animal evolution, and then we'll talk about how they moved out of an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. Then we'll talk about how animals maintain homeostasis, and then there'll be another exam. And then we'll do the last exam, which will be the ecology. And I've decided that I'm going to make the final not really comprehensive. It'll just cover ecology because the final is going to count kind of twice. It's going to count as your last unit exam and your final exam as well. So hopefully it'll help some of your grades do well. The next two exams will be just like the last exam. I'm going to post a study guide online because there's so much memorization on here. You'll have homework activities, but then the study guide, I'll just take the exam questions from the study guide because some people did pretty well. If you did not do well, I cannot help you. Some of you are really failing this class. And I have done everything I can for you besides take the exam for you. So if you're not getting your degree, it's kind of on you. So let's go ahead and get started on the colonization of land. All right. So the first section of your book was entitled The Greening of Earth. We kind of skipped the chapter on how Earth kind of like came into being and all of the origins of life. But for more than 2 billion years of Earth's history, the land surface was just rock. I mean, there was nothing there. It was just like, cooled magma. All right? And then we know that cyanobacteria and protists probably existed on land about 1.2 billion years ago. So that's almost a billion years that there was no life on land. Okay, so we also know from the fossil record and various biochemical tests that about 500 million years ago, plants and fungi and animal moved from the ocean onto land. And the first forest formed about 385 million years ago. All right, so how did the colonization of land change the world? Well, obviously, it allowed for us to exist and study this stuff. All right, so fungi are more closely related to animals than they are plants. I know people think that they're kind of like plants, but they're not. They're more closely related on a cladogram to animals than they are plants. And they actually colonized lands, they came out of the ocean onto land as plants did. Okay, so first were plants and fungi. They came out of the ocean together. And then animals didn't come until much, much later. Plants, we know, supply oxygen and are the ultimate source of most of the foods that are eaten by land animals. And we also know that fungi break down organic material and make chemical nutrients available for plants. And that mutualistic symbiotic relationship that we learned in 9th grade that exists mostly between the fungi in the soil and the plant root system. Animals didn't move out of the water onto the land until way after the plants and the fungi had already been on land and colonized land for quite some time. Okay, so here we're looking at a cladogram, and we can see last common ancestor would be back here, and then you can see the most recent common ancestor is actually between fungi and animal would be right here. So Luca, last universal common ancestor, would be back here for plants, animals, and fungus. And then we also can see from this cladogram, looking at biochemistry, that fungi and animal are actually more closely related than fungi and plants. Even though most people think that mushrooms are plants, they are not. All right. So fossils show that plants actually colonized land more than 470 million years ago. Green algae, called chorophytes, are the closest relatives that we know of that exist in the fossil record to land plants. So how do we know that algal ancestors are the common ancestor to plants. So we know that plants are multicellular, they're eukaryotic, they're photosynthetic autotrophs, and their cell walls are made of cellulose, and chloroplasts contain both two pigment types, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Now some, but not all of the algae are going to share these characteristics. And when we look for common ancestry, we're looking at how many biochemical features do they share in common. Okay, some plants some plant traits are only shared with one group of green algae called the charophytes. Plants and charophytes have rings of cellulose synthesizing protein complexes, and non-charophyte algae have linear proteins with the same function. So our first evidence that charophytes and modern green plants have common ancestry is when we look at the protein complexes that create the cellulose. In charophytes and modern plants, it's ring-shaped in structure, and in non-charophytes, it's going to be linear. We also see that flagellated sperm are structurally similar between the charophytes and the plants that have flagellated sperm, because some plants do. We'll talk about that. Certain types of mosses and things like that that live in very wet environments. Okay, so here is that ring-shaped protein that is going to produce the cellulose that is found in the charophytes and the modern terrestrial plants. And we do not see that in non-charophytes. Okay. All right, so analysis of the nuclear, chloroplast, and mitochondrial DNA also supports that there is strong homology between plants and the living charophytes. The charophytes in the clade Zygonomatophyceae are the ones that are the closest living relatives to plants. Okay, so let's say this together. Zygonomatophyceae. There we go. I can't say it. All right, so this is what it is. All right, if we're looking at the homology of the DNA that we find in the nuclear DNA, chloroplastic DNA, and mitochondrial DNA, we see that the charophytes in this clade are most closely related to modern plants. Okay. All right, so what adaptations had to occur in order for things to move from an aquatic environment into a terrestrial environment? Evolution of traits like something called sporopollenin is a protective polymer that actually surrounds the charophyte zygotes and the plant spores, and they facilitate the movement to dry land. Because in an aquatic environment, you don't have to worry about, it's called desiccation, where the water escapes. This little protective polymer that surrounds things prevents water loss. You don't have to worry about water loss in an aquatic environment because you're surrounded by water. Okay. The terrestrial environment of unfiltered sunlight provided lots of sunlight, obviously, because some sunlight is scattered through the water. But also there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there was a nutrient-rich soil. And land was also, however, land presented challenges because, think about it, when you're surrounded by water, you don't have to worry about getting water. But when you move from the water onto the land, you have to worry about that. Another thing is water actually allows things to, buoyant forces that you learned about in physics. So you don't have to worry about polymers that allow plants to grow upright because they're kind of just floating in the water. Okay, so that's another thing that had to happen in order for plants to move from aquatic environment into a terrestrial environment. All right, so geeky biologists that like to produce cladograms, they are currently debating the boundaries of the plant kingdom. Until this debate is resolved, we define plants as embryophytes because their plants actually have embryos. All right, so there are three possible plant kingdoms. All right, moving. If we look here we see the ancestral algae, okay? And this is the last common ancestor for everything in this cladogram. And we can see that this gave rise to something called red algae that we'll talk about later. And then we had this branching network that gave a rise to some common ancestor for all of these green plants that are found here. And those would include the chlorophytes, Those also can include things that are other chlorophytes. There's the closest chlorophyte relatives. And then these are the modern plants that are in the kingdom Plantae that are called the embryophytes. Okay? So these are what systematic people are actually establishing as true plants. Okay? They're the embryophytes because they actually have a developed embryo. All right? All right. So, what derived traits exist in plants? Key traits that appear in nearly all plants but are absent in charophytes. So these are things that you find in plants but you do not find in the charophytes. Something called the alternation of generation. We'll spend a lot of time on that plants do, going back and forth from the diploid phase to a haploid phase. They are multicellular dependent embryos that are present in modern plants that are not found in the charophytes. And there are walled spores produced in something called a sporangia, which we'll talk about. And then there's also something called an apical meristem that we kind of learned in 9th grade that is going to have undifferentiated stem cells found at the tips of the plants that you don't find in charophytes. Now, so what is alternation of generation? I had mentioned that before. That is when the life cycle consists between two generations of distinct multicellular organisms. There's something called the gametophyte, and then there's something called the sporophyte. The gametophyte is going to be the stage of the life cycle that is completely haploid. Now, I know that you go from diploid to haploid, it is undergoing meiosis. But in plants, you can become haploid, and those cells can divide by mitosis. So a haploid cell undergoes mitosis to produce another haploid cells. And that would be happening in the gametophyte stage. And then you have the sporophyte generation, which is diploid, and it undergoes meiosis to produce a haploid. And those haploid things in plants are called spores. Okay? So here we can see we're looking at a fern. We're going to look at a lot of ferns in here. So here we have a fern, and we can see that here we start here in what's called the gametophyte. The gametophyte produces haploid gametes by mitosis. So here we have a cluster of cells, and they are all haploid. All right? It's not just one. It's not like when we were talking about the basis of meiosis. We're having a multicellular organism, but all of the cells are haploid. So these cells produce more haploid cells by mitosis. And then those cells are released. And when they are released independently, they are called a gamete because they are haploid. And then when they fuse with another gamete from another plant, that process is called fertilization. And then you get the formation of the first zygote. Okay, the zygote is the first diploid cell, and that is now a sporophyte. So this is the sporophyte of the plant, this fern here. All of the cells in it are going to be diploid, and this would be the sporophyte generation. Now, when meiosis occurs on the underside of the fern, it is going to produce spores. So it's going to go from diploid to haploid, and that process called meiosis. And then some of these gametes will just go off and be fertilized. And others will take root and form a whole new plant that is actually just a haploid organism. All right, so let me show you this video. Let me make sure you can hear me. I think it's this one. Maybe that.
Now let's see how the general plant life cycle is similar to the human life cycle. Cells in a diploid plant body undergo meiosis, resulting in haploid cells. Fertilization of a haploid egg cell by a haploid sperm cell results in a diploid zygote. The zygote undergoes mitosis and develops into a new diploid individual. But notice the gap between meiosis and production of gametes. This is where plant and animal life cycles differ. In plants, meiosis and structures called sporangia result in haploid cells known as spores. The diploid plant that produces spores is the sporophyte. A haploid spore undergoes many mitotic cell divisions and develops into a haploid multicellular individual. The sporophyte in this example is a fern, and the plant that develops from a fern spore is shown here. The new haploid multicellular plant is called the gametophyte because it produces gametes, egg and sperm cells. The gamete-producing structures are called gametangia. What process do you think occurs in the gametangia to produce egg and sperm cells?
Mitosis.
In the plant life cycle, unlike the human life cycle, gametes result from mitosis. This diagram summarizes the general plant life cycle. Plants are said to undergo an alteration of generations because the diploid sporophyte and haploid gametophyte are multicellular forms that occur alternately in the life cycle. Each form produces the other. All plants follow this same life cycle pattern, but each group of plants has certain variations. One variation is the relative size and longevity of the sporophyte and gametophyte. Notice that the fern sporophyte is much larger and longer lived than the gametophyte, which is about the size of the nail on your little finger. Another variation is whether the sporophyte and gametophyte live independently of each other. This is the case in ferns.
Okay, so what do I do? Oh, no, I didn't mean to do that. What am I doing? That's not what I wanted to do. Hold on. No, delete. What do I do? There we go. Hold on, I gotta get my thing back up. New movie. There we go. Okay, so that's just showing. Oops, there I went again. That's just showing exactly what I just said about the alternation of generation in a fern. You have what's called the diploid phase, and then you have the haploid phase. The sporophyte is going to be the phase that actually produces the spore. So that's where meiosis occurs. In the gametophyte, that is going to be the one where the gametes, actually the haploid cells, become multicellular structures just about the size of your little finger, and they can, it's a multicellular complex, all of haploid cells, and they produce the gametes. Okay? All right. So we also know that plants are going to be multicellular and they have dependent embryos. The multicellular diploid embryo is retained within the tissue of the female gametophyte, and nutrients are transferred from the parent to the embryo through a placental transfer cells, which are found in plants. And plants are called embryophytes because of their dependence on the embryo on the plant. Okay. So here we see, let me show you. Here we have the multicellular dependent embryo. So here is the embryo of the developing plant, the true plant, and then here is the maternal tissue. So this developing embryo is getting nutrients from these placental cells coming from the maternal tissue of the plant to the embryo. Okay, you don't see these in charophytes. Okay, show that. Show that. Okay. We also have the walled spores that are produced by sporangia. Sporangia are going to be these specialized structures that are found in sporophytes that actually produce the spores. And spore walls contain something called sporopollenin, which actually makes them resistant to the harsh environments on land. Again, so it prevents the embryo from becoming, or the spores, I'm sorry, from losing water. All right, so here is the sporangium, and the sporangium is going to actually, this whole thing is called the sporophyte, and it is found on the gametophyte. And then in here we have the developing spores. So you can see here's the sporangium, this is the sporophyte, this is the gametophyte, and then you can see the little spores inside that. The pollenin, is actually going to prevent the spores from desiccating too. All right, we also learned in 9th grade about apical meristems, and those are going to be clusters of undifferentiated cells, cells that have not decided what they want to be, at the very tippy top of the plant as it grows upward. That's why, you know, if you trim the top of a tree, it grows outwards. They contain apical meristems. That's what true plants will have. All right. Another thing you have to worry about when you move from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment is the loss of water. So we actually have the evolution of that cuticle, and that's that waxy layer that is going to prevent water loss in the leaves of plants and in the stems of plants, but it also helps prevent microbial attack. We always think of us being attacked by bacteria and viruses, but plants get those too. We also learned in ninth grade about the stomata that are found on the underside of the plant. And remember, those were those little openings. They look like little mouths, and they allow for carbon dioxide to go into the leaf and then oxygen to come out at the end of photosynthesis. Okay. So early plants, we know that the fossil record indicates that plants were on land at least 470 million years ago. They've also found fossilized spores and tissues that have been extracted from 450 million year old rocks. Okay, so these are examples of the fossilized spores that they found, and they look and they see that the chemical composition and the physical structure of the walls of these 450 million year old spores match those that you find in certain plants today. And when you looked at fossilized sporophyte tissue, the spores in here were actually embedded in tissue that appears to be from plants. Okay, so again, these are fossilized spores, and this is fossilized spores. So these little dents here contain the spores. Long story short, that's what you're looking at. Because you're like, what is this? All right, fossils of large plant structures, including the sporangia, appeared in the fossil record about 425 million years ago. And by 400 million years ago, a diverse assemblage of plants lived on land. You can see all of this in the fossil record. Unique traits in these early plants include the specialized tissues needed for water transport. Remember xylem. They've also found cuticles, stomata, and branched sporophytes. Okay, so this is a fossil of a Cooksonia sporangium, and it's about 425 million years old. And remember, the sporangium is that specialized organ that is going to actually produce the spore. Okay, okay, so here is the sporangium. Okay, alrighty. And that's the stomata, remember, that's on the underside of the leaf that we know opens and allows carbon dioxide to go in and oxygen to come out. All right, though not closely related to plants, fungi play a key role in the colonization of land. So for this first lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about fungus, why it's important, and we'll end this lecture. And then in the next lecture, I'll talk more about the evolution of plants. And then we'll talk about next week about the angiosperms that produce like fruit and things like that we eat, and flowers. So let's focus on fungus. The earliest land plants actually lacked roots and leaves. So you're like, well, how did they get all the nutrients that they needed? Fossil evidence actually tells us that the plants formed that symbiotic relationship called mutualism with fungi that actually helped them obtain the nutrients that they need. So we know from ninth grade that fungi are heterotrophs and they absorb their nutrients from outside their body. So they, like if you're a cell, they secrete the digestive enzymes and then they kind of suck it in. The morphology of multicellular fungi actually enhance their ability to absorb nutrients. And fungi, the largest living organism on Earth, is actually fungus that exists in a certain forest. And I want to say it's in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon maybe. Fungi actually consist of these branch networks called hyphae, and these are filaments of the fungus that are adapted for absorption of nutrients into the individual cells. Mycorrhizae are plant-fungal symbiotic relationships in which the fungus hyphae are going to transfer nutrients to their plant partner. And this symbiotic association actually may have helped the plants that didn't have roots colonize land. Okay, so what does this look like? So here you have a fungal hyphae, and here you have plant cells. So you can see that the fungal hyphae actually have appendages that go into the plant cells, and they actually are going to take some of the food that is generated by the plant, and they are going to feed the fungus, and the fungus is going to produce specific things that the plant needs, like water and things like that, and inject it into there. So it's this cute little symbiotic relationship. So where did these fungi come from? Fungi and animals are more closely related to each other than they are to plants or other eukaryotic organisms. So fungi are more closely related to unicellular protists called nuclearids than they are to animals. And these animals are more closely related to different groups of protists called choanoflagellates. The multicellularity that exists likely evolved independently in the different ancestors of fungi and animals. Okay, so it wasn't like you had this fungi here, animals here, and it's not like you had a last common ancestor that was multicellular. You had a last common ancestor that was probably unicellular, and as it branched off to go to animals and fungi, the multicellularity occurred right here on the tree of life. The ancestors of animals are estimated to have diverged over 1 billion years ago, and the oldest undisputed fossil of fungi are terrestrial species from about 460 million years ago. And these are the fossilized fungus that I'm talking about. You can see here the hyphae. Fungi have adaptations that would have made them well suited for feeding on early terrestrial organisms or their remains. Fungi are heterotrophs that feed by absorption, so it's kind of like they secrete the digestive. It'd be like if you covered yourself in peanut butter, and then your skin secreted digestive enzymes to break down the peanut butter, and then your skin sucked it in. That's kind of how fungi do. They secrete the hydrolytic enzymes to break down complex molecules into simpler organic molecules, and they can digest compounds from a wide variety of sources that are living or dead. So we definitely need fungi to help, otherwise we'd be covered in dead stuff. Fungi have many traits that facilitate feeding by absorption. For example, absorbed nutrients are concentrated inside the cell, causing water to flow in by osmosis. Fungi, they do not have cell walls made of cellulose. Theirs, remember, is made of chitin, and that prevents the cell from bursting. Because if you have a lot of organic molecules on the inside, water's going to want to go down its concentration gradient, and if you didn't have chitin, the fungal cell would explode. Okay, fungi consist of this interwoven mass of branched hyphae called a mycelium. So the hyphae branch, and the web that it forms is called the mycelium. The branch structure of the mycelium actually maximizes its surface to volume ratio, making absorption more efficient. Some species grow as single cell. Yeast is an example of a fungus that is single cellular, and some of them can alternate between single cellular and multicellular. Okay, now, most people are familiar with a mushroom. Now, this is what I'm talking about before. The mushroom is actually just the reproductive part of the fungus. The actual body of the fungus is down here. So this is the mycelium. See how I said it looked like a web-like structure? This is the mycelium. And the mycelium are made up of hyphae, okay? So the hyphae can actually extend up into the mushroom part, but the mushroom is going to just be the part that's the reproductive, and it's going to produce spores. So anytime you're seeing a mushroom or you're eating a mushroom, you're actually eating the reproductive part of a fungus, right? Reproductive part of the fungus. Okay. All right, now let me get rid of this. There's a pointer. Change. There we go.
Fungi are multicellular, heterotrophic organisms with bodies composed of long threads of cells called hyphae. Hyphae obtain nutrients by absorbing pre-digested food. Fungi reproduce sexually or asexually by producing spores which are dispersed by the wind. Spores that land on a moist substrate will begin to germinate. These spores grow into long branching hyphae. A tangled network of hyphae is called a mycelium. Mycelia can be huge. There are reports that the species Armillaria bulbosa have spreading mycelia that can cover hundreds of acres. As a group, fungi are decomposers and play a key role in the food web. As mycelia grow, they release digestive enzymes into their surroundings. These enzymes break down the macromolecules found in leaves and other decaying matter, liberating smaller subunits like sugars and amino acids. Let us look at how fungi digest and absorb their food. To begin their extracellular digestion, fungi must first release many digestive enzymes. These enzymes decompose complex molecules like cellulose, RNA, proteins, and fats into simpler subunits like glucose, nucleic acids, amino acids, and fatty acids. Once these smaller monomers are produced, the fungal cell absorbs them into its cytoplasm, where they are used to provide energy for the fungal cell or as building blocks for fungal macromolecules. The mushrooms that we find in the forest are the reproductive structures of large underground mycelia. The spores that the mushrooms produce germinate and grow into hyphae.
And now you know. Alrighty. So, organisms that maximize the surface area have increased efficiency in the uptake of energy and raw materials such as oxygen and nutrients. We learned this again. You want to maximize surface area, you want to minimize volume. Okay, that's the whole key to diffusion. So this is showing just a general trend that we see in biology. You did way back when, remember adaptive curriculum? You actually did an adaptive curriculum on this. Anytime you see folding, flattening in biology, branching, that is to increase surface area without increasing volume. Okay. There we go. All right, so mycorrhizae. I always want to say micro, but it's myco. Mycorrhizae, these are important because these are the ones that have created a symbiotic relationship called mutualism between the root, the cells in plants, and their surroundings, okay? So there are two main types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's arbuscular mycorrhizae, and those actually extend their hyphae through the cell wall of the root cells into tubes formed by invagination of the root cell membrane. And then there's ectomycorrhizae, and these actually form sheets of hyphae over the root and also grow into the extracellular spaces of the root cortex. In mycorrhizae, the fungi improves the delivery of phosphate ions and other minerals to the plant. So they take the phosphate from the soil and give it to the plant. And then the plant obviously is producing glucose through photosynthesis. So it says, hey, if you give me the phosphates from the soil, then I'll give you the extra sugar that I make. And the fungus is like, okay. Right? Fossil evidence shows that some fungi formed mutualistic relationships with early land plants. An example that they give in the text is a 405 million-year-old fossil of an algophytant that contained evidence of fossil hyphae penetrating deep into the plant cells in the root. Okay. Molecular evidence suggests that the genes required for the establishment of the mycorrhizae symbiosis were present in common ancestors to plants. Molecular analysis have helped clarify evolutionary relationships between fungal groups. Although areas of uncertainty remain, there are about 100,000 known species of fungi, but there are an estimated to be about 1.5 million species. So this is showing the evolution. Oops, you can't see. Evolution of fungi. So here you have last common ancestor, and here you have the chytrids. There's about 1,000 species of this. The zygomyces, there's 1,000 species of this. The glomerulomyces, 200 species. The ascomyces, which are going to be like the cup ones, cup fungus, sac fungus, sorry, and then the basidiomyces, which you're more familiar with, that look like the mushrooms. Okay. When we look at the different types of fungi, we have chytrids, 1,000 species. They're found in freshwater and terrestrial habitats. These actually have flagellated spores that have diverged early in fungal evolution, so they're on their own little clade. Okay, and here you can see them. Okay, let's see. I don't really care. Yeah, I'm sure you're like, I really don't care about fungus, but this is showing. Sorry. You can see that the spore is moving through flagella. Okay.
The aquatic fungus Flictochytrium reproduces asexually by converting the entire contents of its flask-shaped body into flagellated zoospores. Here you can see a number of zoospores being rapidly released through a pore in the body. The spores swim away and attach to a substrate, where they retract the flagella and under suitable conditions grow into a new flask-shaped body.
Okay. Okay, zygomyces are mycetes, sorry. Those are going to be decomposing fungus, parasitic fungus, and commensal symbionts. Remember, commensalism is when one is helped, but another is neither harmed nor helped. Okay. Glomerulomycetes is going to be 200 species. This is going to be the arbuscular mycorrhizae with the plant roots. Okay, acidomyces are also called the sac fungus. You find them in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial habitats. So see, it forms like a little sac. Basidomyces are also called the club fungus. I can't speak. It's been a long spring break. These are important decomposers, and they're also the ectomycorrhizae. So they don't penetrate into the cell of the plant. They actually just create a sheet on the outside of the root. The fruiting bodies of these are the ones that we call mushrooms. See? Okay. Fungi have an extremely variable life cycle and means of reproduction. Most are going to propagate themselves by using a vast number of spores that they release into the environment, and it can be either asexual or sexual in reproduction. Plasmogamy is the union of the cytoplasm of two haploid parent mycelia. So hours or days or even centuries may pass before the karyogamy, the fusion of the haploid nuclei, occur. So you have two cells, their cytoplasm fuses, but the nuclei do not fuse together. Okay? When the nuclei, and they're still haploid nuclei, but they're in the same cytoplasm. So when they fuse together, they form the diploid. Okay, and that would be the karyogamy. The diploid phase is short-lived and undergoes meiosis, producing haploid spells. Karyogamy and meiosis generate genetic variation. In addition to sexual reproduction, many fungi can reproduce asexually. Molds produce haploid spores by mitosis and form visible mycelia. Single-cell yeast divide by producing genetically identical daughter cells asexually. This is the general life cycle of the fungi. So let me go with the laser pointer. So here you have it's stuck in the haploid phase. So you have spore-producing structures produce spores. They land, they germinate, they produce mycelium, and the cycle goes round and round. It's all haploid. Then sometimes you have the fusion of two haploid cells, okay? The two haploid cells can come together, but remember, even though the cells fuse together, their nucleus don't fuse together. So that's called the plasmogamy, the fusion of the cytoplasm. But you have two distinct haploid nuclei within that cell. When the nuclei fuse together, that's called karyogamy, and now we've finally got the first diploid, and then it immediately undergoes meiosis to produce spores, and then the cycle goes on and on. Alrighty, and that is it for fungus. So I'm going to stop there, and then I will see you in the next video that I will produce from school for the evolution of plants. Now that you've learned everything you want to know about fungus, but we're afraid to ask. All right, see you in the next video.